Welcome to the Harry Bridges School of Labor, presented by Labor United Educational League. Our purpose is to educate the workers of America on the strength of unions and to foster a class-conscious workforce. We aim to connect the struggles of the past with the struggles of today to empower the labor movement to transform from their present hopeless defensive fight into an aggressive attack upon capital. We plan to empower workers with knowledge regardless of industry or type of work, bringing all workers to a class-oriented trade union movement. And tonight's class is the organizing of Black workers during the formation of industrial unions. So we'll go over the historical background of Black workers in America and overviews of the organizing of Black workers in meatpacking and sleeping car porters, organizing of Black workers in the International Longshoremen Workers Union, uh, organizing and strike of food, tobacco, and agricultural and allied workers local 22.
Section 1, Historical Background of Black Workers in America and an Overview of Organizing Black Workers in Meatpacking as well as the Sleeping Car Porters. Beginnings of African labor in North America. The North American colonies had supported themselves with the use of tobacco as one of the major early cash crops. This created a large demand for labor that was filled by the importation of both indentured persons and to a greater extent African slaves, chiefly brought in by the southern planters. In colonial America, there was something called guilds that would eventually be displaced by the increasing cost for individual producers to practice their craft independently, as well as the competitiveness of social industry. A big weight on labor had been the slaves. For the carpenter, as an example, would be placed in competition for projects such as shipbuilding, caulking, mining, but most were mainly plantation workers. The colonial regime began enshrining the status of Africans in Virginia with the case of John Punch in the 1640s, where he and two whites were apprehended while trying to escape. They were subsequently punished with lifelong servitude, which led to legislation in places like New York, which passed a law in 1703 establishing the death penalty for slaves as a consequence of running away or rebellion. New York became an epicenter of the slave trade, with African slaves reaching a staggering 43% of the population. One of the earliest law enforcement tools developed by the colonial governments was a system of watchmen employed by private citizens. This would become the slave patrol under the control of the planters. As the 18th became the 19th century, the population of slaves would continue to expand under the conditions of technical advancement in transportation and the creation of the mechanical cotton gin. The free Black population in the years of slavery comprised of a mix of runaways, mixed race marriages, and individuals who had purchased their freedom. In certain areas, such as Spanish or French North America, as a result of colonial power plays to fill the manpower gap, Africans could be freed in exchange for military service. The American Revolution transformed the position of the Black population as a whole. Some states emancipated African Americans, and others granted property owners the right to vote, such as Massachusetts in 1780. Ordinances secured the status of the territories north of the Ohio River as free states. The bosses divide the workers. Since the end of the Civil War, the bosses have always cultivated racial hatred between Black and white workers. Many industries were entirely closed to Black workers, such as steel, auto, rubber, textile, lumber, electrical, and more. However, some were allowed into these industries if they agreed to be scabs when white workers would strike. Even many unions who had conservative leadership would enact their own racial discrimination to the detriment of all workers, since this hostility led to many Black leaders disregarding unions as a way to improve the lot of Black workers. Kelly Miller, a Black professor at Harvard, in dealing with Black workers and trade unionism, said, "Whatever good or evil the future may hold for him, today's wisdom, heedless of logical consistency, demands that he stand shoulder to shoulder with the captains of industry." The UNIA. Frustrated with the realities of discrimination on and off the job under Jim Crow, many Black workers came together to form the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey in 1917. This militant organization was one of the first which took up the plight of Black workers in the United States. The UNIA fought exclusion from trade unions, deprivation of land, taxation without representation, unjust military service, Jim Crow laws, and lynching. At its height, it had nearly 500,000 members, making it the largest political organization for Black workers at the time. However, it would slowly decline due to a lack of class orientation, culminating in it advancing stock trading during the quote-unquote prosperity years of President Coolidge, and the entire organization folding in 1925 after Garvey was arrested for defrauding the UNIA of $500,000. Organizing the meatpacking industry. At the same time as the UNIA took its first steps, William Z. Foster and J. W. Johnston led the biggest organizing drive of Black workers in U.S. labor history in the meatpacking plants, which had become enormous due to World War I. Since the early 20th century, the meatpacking industry remained unorganized and was deemed by the American Federation of Labor to be, quote-unquote, unorganizable. On the basis of forming a federation of the small craft unions within the industry, Foster and Johnston employed a militant organizing and strike policy in July of 1917. Once a significant portion of the industry had become organized, a national strike was launched and ended successfully in March of 19, with an arbitration agreement granting wage increases, the 8-hour day, and union recognition, among other improvements. This organizing campaign success meant that the Chicago Federation of Labor now had the largest body of Black workers anywhere in the world. Over 20,000 Black workers out of 200,000 who had been organized nationally were brought into unions during this campaign. Important strides were made in fighting the idea that unions were bad for Black workers, an idea which was purposely cultivated by the bosses. A success which was built upon by the Trade Union Educational League in the early 1920s was to fully realize the truth that Black workers did not have to fight alone. And here we have a picture. These men are in the frontline trenches in Packingtown's Great Labor Controversy. It says 8 out of the 14 Packingtown Workers Organizing Committee have race men as presidents. Men elected to these responsible positions partly through the votes of white workers who until recently looked upon Black men as their natural enemies. Here are a few representing the workers in the present labor controversy with Armour and Company. And it shows Arthel Shelton on the left, PWOC field representative, Hank Johnson and Don Harris in the middle, national directors, and on the right, Jeff Beckley, president of the Armour local of the PWOC. These men have aided in destroying color prejudice among stockyard workers. Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was founded on August 25, 1925 in New York City. The union was the first predominantly African-American labor union in the country and represented the porters for Pullman rail cars. Civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph was chosen to be the leader of the BSCP because he was not employed by the Pullman Company. Thus, unionizing would not cost him his job. Randolph was known for being an advocate for workers' rights, and he edited a socialist magazine called The Messenger, which he used to raise awareness of the labor movement. This marked the beginning of a 12-year struggle for dignity, better working conditions, and fair pay. Their eventual triumph marked the first time in American history that a Black union forced a powerful corporation to the negotiating table. It was a significant step forward for Black equality. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters faced resistance from both the Pullman Company as well as Black leaders who viewed the Pullman Company positively for hiring Black workers. The BSCP also faced resistance from the American Federation of Labor, which was unwilling to charter the BSCP as an international charter. Workers were regularly fired for their involvement in union activity. The federal government denied the union's demand for recognition. The main demands of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters were a 240-hour basic month, pay for preparatory time and delays, shorter runs, more sleep on the road, decreased work expenses, control of quote-unquote doubling out, a living wage, and an independent union recognized by the Pullman Company. A key part of the fight was the Colored Women's Economic Council, founded by the wives of Pullman porters. The auxiliary group raised money for the effort and organized letter-writing campaigns that supported labor-friendly legislation. They often held their meetings when their husbands were out on the road and could not be suspected of organizing, McWatt wrote. A favorable turn in the political climate brought about by the New Deal, combined with persistence of union leaders and members, finally forced the company to recognize the BSCP in 1935. The AFL granted the BSCP an international charter in that same year, and after protracted negotiations, the union won its first contract in 1937.
And with that, we'll go to our first round of questions. One thing I think I'd like to bring up is the meatpacking industry organizing that was done. I believe that that record still has not been surpassed again with the how many Black workers were organized in a single campaign.
Most of these African American leaders who were socialists were in effect social democrats. That's the type of socialists they were. They were social democrats. They were not Marxist Leninists at all. And they caused a problem for the more radical militant organizations of African Americans. A. Philip Randolph, for example, was one of these kind of people. And he was with, his idea was to get, Blacks away from the Communist Party and the left. So he was big with the Teachers Union in New York. They have something called the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which is a labor formation, labor think tank, organized by the social democratic forces. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. We can go to section 2.
Okay, section 2, industrial organizing and the Great Depression. In 1929, a special effort had been made to have a large Black delegation to the Tool Conference in Cleveland. In every delegation from every industry where, I'll say Blacks are employed, William Z. Foster had insisted there must be a heavy percentage of these workers included. There must be present Blacks from all the important plants and localities. Henry C. Roseman was a Black vice president of the Needle Trades Workers Industrial Union, supplemented Foster's statement with his own appeal. The Women's Conference was chaired by Mary Voice, a Black representative of a ladies' auxiliary of the National Miners Union, and one of 7 delegates from the miners' auxiliaries. The Trade Union Unity League demands the fullest participation and leadership of the Black workers in all the organizations and movements of the working class. The tool will organize Blacks into the new industrial unions with the white workers on the basis of the fullest equality. In the old unions, it will combat all discriminatory practices aimed against Blacks. It demands admission of Blacks into these unions, and where this admittance cannot be accomplished, and where there are still no new industrial unions, it will organize separate unions for Blacks. The CP tool and unemployed councils. It took until 1934 or 35 for a resolution to even be submitted at an AFL convention that called for organization of the unemployed, and then it was rejected. 53 says. It was therefore left to the Communist Party and the Trade Union Unity League to take the lead in organizing the unemployed. At its January 1930 meeting, the Central Committee of the Communist Party pointed out that the stock market crash was only the opening phase of a serious economic breakdown, and it called upon the party membership to begin work among the unemployed. At the same time, the Trade Union Unity League, which at its formation on the eve of the Depression, had declared that one of its aims was to organize the unemployed, began to unite the jobless into groups that were known as councils of the unemployed, but more commonly as unemployed councils. Meetings and marches took place in 38 cities and towns on National Unemployment Day. Shouts of "Don't starve, fight," and "Feed us or shoot us" were heard in every major industrial city in the country. 83,000 workers, 2/3 of them Black, including a line of children, marched in Birmingham, Alabama, under the leadership of the Unemployed Council, demanding work or relief. The children were reported as singing, "Empty is the cupboard, no pillow for the head. We are the hungry children who fight for milk and bread. We are the workers' children who must be fed." While the wages of skilled workers rose, those of unskilled workers, who comprise almost 1/3 of the workforce, actually fell during this period. Women workers in manufacturing, common laborers on the railroads, in the steel industry, and on road construction, foundry workers, farm laborers, and others continued to suffer low wages, as did the great majority of Black workers. The last to be hired, the first to be fired, Blacks experienced widespread unemployment by as early as 1927, according to the monthly bulletin of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In the early months of 1929, with the economy supposedly flourishing as never before, 300,000 Black industrial workers, about one-fifth of all Blacks employed in industry, had already been thrown out of work. Meanwhile, as Greene was echoing President Hoover's refrain that prosperity is just around the corner, economic conditions were continuing to decline. Even before the Depression had hit full force, several thousand families, mostly Black, were evicted in New York City for failure to pay their rent. Long bread lines, soup lines, and lodging lines were becoming a frequent sight in front of such charity institutions as the Salvation Army. Prices dropped sharply. Factories closed. employers cut wages, and more men and women were thrown out of work. The decline in business activity and the rise in unemployment went on virtually uninterrupted. As the Depression deepened, white workers began displacing blacks in the jobs usually reserved for them, digging ditches, waiting on tables, and repairing railroad tracks, and began forcing employers to discharge black workers. When black firemen on the Louisiana division of the Illinois Central Railroad did not vacate their jobs, vigilante groups were organized to warn them that if they did not resign, they would not live to work again. Soon after the Great Depression began, the position of the blacks became desperate. Many employers immediately fired their black workers, although a few discharged whites, first because the blacks often worked for as much as 1/3 less. It soon became the general practice to replace blacks with whites as, quote, Negro wages, or lower. In the North, white girls replaced black waiters, hotel workers, and elevator operators. The Pittsburgh Courier reported on June 27, 1931, that in one city alone, 600 black janitors had lost their jobs to whites. A black steel worker at the Clairton Steel Works in Pennsylvania noted that the company would take a white man right out of the street and make you teach him, and after you teach him, they give him your job. And during the summer of 1930, the fascist black shirts in Atlanta, with some 40,000 followers, made up of Klansmen, jobless whites, and restless youths, set out with the blessings of the city's power structure to drive blacks from all jobs. The black shirts advanced the slogan, if white men would assert their rights, there would be no unemployment in Atlanta and other cities of the South. White workers were told that if they wanted jobs or feared the labor competition of Negroes, all they had to do was to organize. The black shirts predicted that before Christmas, there isn't going to be a black bellboy or truck driver in Atlanta. This is white man's country, and there are too many Negroes in jobs and too many white men out of jobs. Throughout the Depression years, the percentage of black unemployed continued to exceed that of either native or foreign-born whites. The U.S. Bureau of Census Special Unemployment Census showed the following unemployment percentage figures by race and nativity among male workers in 13 U.S. cities for January 1931. Manufacturing and mechanical industries. White, native-born, 3.7. White, foreign-born, 29.9%. Black, 30.7%. A National Urban League summary for 1931, based on reports from investigators in 106 cities, showed that the proportion of unemployed blacks was from 30 to 60% greater than that of whites, and that of the percentage of blacks among the unemployed ran sometimes 4, 5, and 6 times as high as their population percentage. So, all right. In April 1931, about 1/7 of the black males and 1/12 of the black females in the North were unemployed. For whites, the proportions were 1/12 for males and 1/12 for females. As the gap between black and white unemployment rates widened, the National Urban League gloomily concluded in March 1931, Negroes have lost jobs to which they will not return even when normal times come again. In Detroit, about 1/3 of the white males and 1/6 of the white females were without jobs. while 60% of the black males and 3/4 of the black females were unemployed. In Harlem, unemployment climbed to nearly 50% by conservative estimates, and at times the estimates ran as high as 60%. The income of the average Harlem family in the early 1930s decreased to half its level in the late 1920s without any corresponding reduction in the cost of living. The Fur Department's Unemployed Council fought through scores of cases of workers who received eviction notices. Workers forcibly moved out of their homes by the police notified the Unemployed Council and had their furniture promptly moved back. Relief bureaus delinquent in providing cash relief payments were compelled to speed up their work and provide them. It is a fact that not one family of a worker who registered a complaint with the NTWIU's Unemployed Council was ever evicted. In every city which the unemployed organized and protested, violent and sometimes fatal confrontations with the police took place. In August of 1931, 3 black workers were killed in an anti-eviction battle with the Chicago police. More than 100,000 citizens marched in their funeral procession, and 60,000 of them went to City Hall to protest police brutality.
And with that, we'll go to our third round of questions.
Yeah, I think we see really clearly here how the racial divisions between the workers were exploited by the bosses. And I can't help but think of the parallels today when you look at, you could say, native-born workers versus immigrant workers, especially undocumented immigrants, where now a lot of these native-born workers are convinced it's a good thing to try to get rid of these immigrant workers. And the ultimate result is just a worse situation for all of them in actuality. Thank you.
So I was just wondering, if it was like these industries were what they were organizing at the time that had such high numbers of African Americans. I just was wondering what it looks like nowadays. Like, where do all the black people work nowadays? And I just figured I'd look it up. And as of 2023, it says that 21.6% of African Americans are in professional and related occupations. I still haven't figured out exactly what that means, but maybe we can draw our own conclusions. And then right behind that is service occupations at 21.5%. And then management, business, and financial, and then office and administrative supportive occupations. So I haven't figured out a very concise conclusion of what to make with this information, but it seems that black people have worked into a lot of white-collar jobs since 100 years ago. Not a big surprise there, except for the service industry, where they all still have a large representation. So just food for thought. I guess if we wanted to see something similar, it would have to be focused on the service industry of today.
Yeah, the meat packing industry today is like it's like 10% blacks and 90% Latinos, which are all illegal. They prefer to hire illegals. Just down the street from my house, literally like 100 feet away, there used to be a slaughterhouse for chickens, and across the street from that there's these slums essentially. There used to be. They tore them all down very recently, this last year. And I once tried to get the people to sign up for this tenant union when I was like 14 or something. I don't remember. And the only people who signed on to it was this guy who was probably he lived in pretty much a slum. It was a one-room apartment, and there's this lady who had a wheelchair. She didn't even have legs or something. I don't know. And the guy, and it was completely slums. But yeah, there's a lot of hope for the meat packing industry. I used to believe I hate the meat workers there because no, not the meat workers there. I didn't think about that when I was really young. I used to be like an ultra leftist. So I was like, oh, meat workers, they oppress animals. But that's just, yeah, they do, but you gotta organize them. It doesn't matter. That's subjective. Morality, you're just hurt. That doesn't help anything. Progress the world. They're revolutionary compared to service workers or anyone. They need to be organized. You need to love the workers. They're your kind. That's all.
Well, a big factor in that is, as is no secret, probably since the days of like the anti-WTO protests of like the 90s. The fact that uh, the way that American monopoly has restructured the American economy is it has decided to take offshoring further than it did in the 70s. There's always been an international component, but especially at the end of the Soviet Union, it became a lot more.
Yeah, I was just really interested in the unemployment councils. I know that Henry Winston talked about this when he moved to New York. I think in Harlem, he talked about organizing the unemployment councils. And it seemed like they really did focus on evictions and preventing evictions, kind of similar to what tenants unions today do, I've noticed. And I don't see an upsurge of unemployment councils, though, where I would think an unemployment council would try to find, well, jobs for the unemployed and probably help them become organized once they do. Um, and it seemed to focus around the, African American community, and where they would be more prone to be taken advantage of from landlords. And that might be the connection with the unemployed. I just find that interesting. I didn't know if in the research anyone found any more background about those unemployment councils. That's all.
Really quick, what our leak mentioned reminded me. Speaking of like slaughterhouses today, my next door neighbor is a guy who he literally retired, got bored, and was like, I'm just gonna go back to work. So he works like 12-hour shifts at a slaughterhouse that's right around just down the street here in Bucks County, PA. And he's told me similarly to what our leak mentioned, is it's mostly nowadays is mostly like undocumented immigrant workforce. My neighbor mentioned that they have a union, but really all they do is try to get people citizen status. I think he told me that they asked him if he wants to become a U.S. citizen. And he's like, I'm a white 60-year-old man who's born in Philadelphia. So I think they're solely focused on helping the workforce get citizenship, which I guess is better than nothing, but also kind of weird. But I think he put it perfectly. when I was talking to him one time, he said, "Who's going to slaughter a cow? Like in this day and age, in the year 2025, I'm not going to slaughter a cow. Sorry." Um, it's the undocumented immigrant population, and I that was a pretty eye-opening perspective, that conversation I had with him. So that's, I guess, sort of a snapshot of what the slaughterhouse industry is like nowadays.
Was it a UFCW? Was that the union?
I think it might be like meat packers. Isn't the meat packing its own craft union? That's what I had in my head, but I don't remember for sure. I think that's what it is, but it might be UFCW. I don't think it is, though. I would have remembered UFCW if he said that.
Yeah, and the other thing is that these companies, by and large, support and encourage people to come across the border. That's how they're able to staff their companies. I mean, these companies, I don't want to get into it, but there's been several laws, like if anyone's familiar with the UFW, United Farm Workers Union, and everything that kind of went along with them, is that these agribusiness companies very much work with people in Mexico to bring them across the border, so that they can undermine the workers here. Maybe we can do a class on the UFW at some point, but yeah, they very much need these people, and in a lot of ways, the anti-immigrant rhetoric is a way to keep them in line, to make them scared. But I think I'm interested to know what that union's doing now with everything going on.
Mentioned like organizing the service sector. Like I remember in the class we had recently talked about like I forget the exact term, like that certain workers, like industrial workers, are like the key to the economy, or I forget the exact words, and that how do we, even though organizing service workers important, how do we determine like do that without neglecting the other workers that are like the key to the economy?
Yeah, workers in the basic industries or key
Yeah.
industries. Yeah, you have to take a balanced approach. Any worker who sells their labor power for a wage is a worker. But there are particular industries which are important to the national economy. And so strategically, the Perry Bridges School of Labor has to base itself among there. So that's kind of the approach that we have to take with that. Some people say that service workers aren't workers, or they'll say that other types of workers aren't workers, but they are. And it's not an either or situation. It's everyone who, like I said, who sells their labor power as a worker. So we have to take a balanced approach to it. We're not going to turn down any organizing attempt of service workers, put it that way.
To add on to the immigration discussion, really since like the implementation of NAFTA, like most of the immigration isn't really Mexicans anymore. It's like victims like Hondurans who have spent decades under the National Party, and Ecuador, who are signing the new. Those are kind of tertiary marks. It doesn't. It's not important.
Section 3. Organizing the Food, Tobacco, Agricultural, and Allied Workers Local 22. Organizing Local 22. Local 22 of the Food, Tobacco, Agricultural, and Allied Workers was a short-lived union at RJ Reynolds tobacco plant in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Primarily organized by Black women in the Jim Crow South, the story of Local 22 is the embodiment of the slogan, quote, "Black and white unite and fight." The seeds of what would become Local 22 were planted when in winter 1942, the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, UCAPAWA, sent organizer Franklin Darnes to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, with a few copies of the Yucapahua News, to distribute for the purpose to, quote, "begin building the base for a labor organization." Soon enough, interest among workers was built to where an office was rented and a tobacco workers organizing committee was formed. Soon after, Franklin Darnes was drafted into the war, but Yucapahua replaced him with two experienced organizers, Henry Coger and William DeBerry, who sought out to gain support from the Black churches in Winston-Salem. A core team of rank-and-file organizers was put together. They were motivated to join the campaign by the union's goals of higher wages, better working conditions, and equal rights, and even by a long-standing indignation at the injustices of Southern society, including the repression of textile workers in Gastonia. These rank-and-file leaders represented a generation of articulate, aspiring, and relatively well-educated Black workers. Most had come of age in the early 1930s. Segregation, discrimination, and depression had combined to limit their prospects severely, but the stirring rhetoric, if not always the actual policies of the New Deal, whetted their appetites for greater social and economic opportunities. Denied jobs commensurate with their training, intelligence, and ability, they sought ways to challenge the restrictions of Jim Crow. Organizers spent hours knocking on doors and distributing leaflets around the plants. The organizers sent by Yucapahua became familiar figures to thousands of Reynolds employees as they stood at the factory gates daily handing out literature for the campaign. Rank-and-file organizer Robert Black on the early stages of the campaign. Quote, "We began to have discussions on Sunday afternoons after church. The organizers would instruct us how you go about building a union. DeBerry would sit in the meetings with us, and we would always have broad discussions about how unions were built, how they were operated. It was a slow process, but we never gave up the idea of building a union. And the company's executives would read it and laugh about it, because they didn't see how we were ever going to get the workers together to build a union. The false confidence of management allowed Black workers room to maneuver. The NLRB's reinstatement of Rule White, a local tobacco workers international union, TWIU, leader, who had been fired during an earlier organizing campaign, may have made officials cautious about interfering with union activity. This hands-off policy by management and the workers' determination created a space where ideas and organization could develop. The regular workers' meetings with Yucapahua organizers served as an educational opportunity for both workers and organizers. Organizers passed on the knowledge and experience that they had gained in the labor movement. Workers then taught the organizers about life on the shop floor and in Winston-Salem. The meetings mixed practical training with discussions of labor's roles in American history and workers' struggles in other industries. Darnes, DeBerry, and Coger also offered a critique of capitalism and white supremacy that combined a class-oriented trade unionist message with the prophetic vision of the Bible. This critique had an enormous appeal because it resonated with Black workers' culture and experience, even as it elevated the collective efforts of Winston-Salem workers to national and international significance. The organizers sent by Yucapahua believed in rank-and-file organizing. They helped provide a framework and resources for the workers to use, as well as act as facilitators, but the core work of convincing the workers was the duty of the rank-and-file organizers being developed in these meetings. These rank-and-file organizers formed a volunteer service club to sponsor, quote, cottage meetings, arrange entertainment for union gatherings, and staff the union hall. One of the organizers, or occasionally one of the more experienced recruits, would go to someone's home to talk about the union with a few workers invited by the host. Secrecy was one advantage of this strategy. The ability to have frank, in-depth discussions with a group of workers was another. Person-to-person contacts, combined with cottage meetings and occasional gatherings of larger groups in churches or fraternal halls, proved to be the most effective method of recruitment in the long months leading up to the Reynolds walkout. The TWOC was active in more than just organizing the workers. They were involved in the struggles within the greater community. They conducted well-publicized war bond drives. Members helped elderly citizens file claims for old age assistance and consulted with government officials to ensure that the claimants received adequate relief. The TWOC was also involved in the case of William Mason Wellman, who was a black man falsely accused of raping a white woman. In January 1943, CIO organizer Frank Hargrove took over as chairman of the TWOC. A key goal at this time was to organize union-minded white tobacco workers to build a black and white coalition of workers to bring the fight to RJ Reynolds. Black and white TWOC members met separately during the organizing campaign, but Hargrove reported regularly to the Volunteer Service Committee on his contacts with Clark Shepard, Crawford Shelton, and the others. On May 30th, the TWOC held its largest meeting to date, an interracial victory rally at the Mount Calvary Holiness Church. Yucaipawa Vice President Owen Whitfield spoke to more than 350 workers about the need to maintain interracial unity in the war against fascism and stressed the vital role the CIO played in making the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, a reality for Blacks. June 1943 sit-down strike. The organizing drive came to a boiling point on June 17, 1943. 200 women in plant number 65, led by TWOC organizer Theodosia Simpson, stopped work, striking the match that started the flame. Angered by the mistreatment of one of their colleagues earlier that day, they returned to the factory floor after lunch and refused to continue working. Their courage proved infectious, prompting a group of male workers in a neighboring room to join in almost immediately. One of those men, 38-year-old James McCardell, stepped forward and declared his solidarity with the women strikers. Moments later, he fell to the floor, dead of a cerebral hemorrhage. The explosive mix of the work stoppage and McCardell's sudden death, which due to Reynolds's culture of pushing employees to their physical limits, caused long simmering resentment to boil over. News of the strike spread quickly throughout the company's plants. Post-strike negotiations. Within days, the workers had pulled off the unthinkable. They had shut down the operations of one of America's industrial giants and found themselves sitting across the table from Reynolds executives, demanding changes during a strike that lasted 6 days. The workers went back to work after 6 days, during which negotiations took place. Worker representatives gave their grievances on wages, working conditions, and other issues. RJ Reynolds made some minor concessions on working conditions. Union elections. After negotiations ended with little more than a moral victory for the workers, the TWOC demanded a union election. The AFL's Tobacco Workers International Union, TWIU, with jurisdictional claims were added to the election, with the workers divided into 2 bargaining units. Unit 1 representing pre-production works and Unit 2 representing manufacturing workers. In typical AFL fashion, the TWIU ran a racially motivated campaign trying to divide the workers. TWOC had won the Unit 1 elections, while it normally lost Unit 2 to the no union vote. Narrowly lost, excuse me. All sides contested the elections, and the NLRB nullified both elections, leaving the workers in the same position they were in before. After months of legal fights, new elections with the entire plant as one single bargaining unit, in December 1943, 2/3 of the workers voted for TWOC as their union representation. Local 22 is formed. In April 1944, the first contract was agreed to at RJ Reynolds. Included in the agreement were reinstatement of 18 wrongfully terminated workers, the enactment of the seniority system, 1 year leave of absence for a woman wishing to have a child while maintaining her seniority, letter from a doctor overruled medical department on sickness, 4-step grievance system. The National War Labor Board would decide the issue they couldn't agree on, including such key issues as wages, union security, dues checkoff, vacations, and top seniority for shop stewards.
And we'll go to our final round of questions.
This was in the Deep South in the 1940s, and it was a black-led strike. Compare that to nowadays, what we have now. Sure, in a lot of the more liberal states, maternity leave is increasing, but it's still nowhere near what they want. And that's what a militant class unionism can win.
This might be a little off topic, but I just wanted to bring this up. Apologize if I'm being a little insufferable here, bringing up Kansas City, but it's Kansas City Musical Local 627. It's a jazz union that was started by a lot of jazz members. It was originally called like the I forget the name. It was like the Colored Musicians Union, and it operated in Kansas City when Kansas City style jazz was popular until like 1940s. But I just wanted to bring that up if people are interested in it. Maybe we can have a class on it. I would like to bring it up just at this time during Black History Month. That's all.
Yeah, this also makes me think about in the 1960s, famously, there was this a different issue. There was this Klan member who was running for, I'm gonna say it was the House of Representatives in Georgia, and basically one of the, well, I mean, obviously, industry contributes a lot of resources, to get their favorite candidates, and they talked a lot about the welfare state in the South at the time.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, we can go to the closing slides. So you can follow the Harry Bridges School of Labor on Twitter at Louisville_US, or Instagram at Louisville.us, Facebook at laborunited.louisville, YouTube at Labor United, of course our website Louisville.us, and then Labor Today is our publication at labortoday.louisville.us. And our closing video song tonight is going to be the Love Songs medley.